The one enemy that has sabotaged every plan you've ever made, every goal you've ever set, every version of a better life you've ever tried to build, isn't out there. It never was. It's the part of you that knows exactly what needs to be done and still doesn't do it. The part that sets the alarm and hits snooze. That starts the diet on Monday and quits by Thursday. That knows the call needs to be made, the work needs to be done, the direction needs to change, and finds, every single time, a reason to wait until tomorrow. That's not weakness. That's not lack of ambition. That's an unmastered self running on autopilot. Napoleon Hill spent 20 years studying why some people build extraordinary lives while others, with equal intelligence and equal desire, stay exactly where they started. And what he found at the center of every story of genuine transformation wasn't a better strategy, a lucky break, or a superior set of circumstances. It was a person who had learned to master themselves first, not the world, themselves. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that mastery requires, and why, once you have it, the world genuinely runs out of ways to stop you. There's a story most people carry about why their life looks the way it does. It involves circumstances, timing, the specific combination of factors outside their control that made certain things harder than they should have been, that closed doors before they could be walked through, that placed obstacles in paths that, under different conditions, would have been clear. The story isn't entirely wrong. Circumstances are real. Timing matters. Some paths genuinely are harder than others, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone. But Hill found something underneath these stories, something consistent enough across enough different lives and enough different circumstances that he eventually stopped treating it as coincidence. The external obstacles most people pointed to as the primary reason for their limitations were almost never the actual reason. The actual reason was internal, and it wore the same face in every story, regardless of the specific external circumstances surrounding it. Hill called it the unmastered self, not a dramatic villain, not some dark force operating against your conscious will. Something considerably more ordinary and considerably more difficult to address precisely because of how ordinary it is. The gap between knowing and doing, between understanding what needs to change and actually changing it, between recognizing the pattern and interrupting it, between the clear, honest internal assessment of what a situation requires and the behavior that actually shows up when the situation arrives. Most people experience this gap as a personal failing, as evidence of insufficient willpower, insufficient discipline, insufficient character, as the specific proof that they simply don't have what it takes to build the life they want, because if they did, the gap would close. Hill found this interpretation was not just wrong. It was the precise misunderstanding that ensured the gap would never close. Because the gap between knowing and doing isn't a character flaw. It's a structural feature of a mind that hasn't yet been brought under its own authority. And the difference between those two explanations, character flaw versus structural feature, is everything. Because a character flaw is something you are. A structural feature is something you have, something that was built through the accumulated experience of living a certain way, and something that can therefore be rebuilt through the deliberate practice of living differently. Hill documented this distinction with unusual care because he found it was precisely the people who interpreted the gap as a character flaw who never managed to close it. Not because closing it required more than they had, because their interpretation of the gap was consuming the energy that closing it would have required. The person who believes the gap exists because something is fundamentally wrong with them spends their energy managing that belief, defending against it, compensating for it, performing the external appearance of having closed it while it quietly persists underneath. The person who understands the gap as a structural feature of an unmastered mind spends their energy on something entirely different, on the specific, practical work of building mastery. And that work, Hill found, was not what most people imagined when they thought about self-mastery. It didn't look like the heroic exercise of iron will. It didn't require the kind of exceptional character most people assumed they lacked. It looked like something much more accessible and much more interesting. Because here's what Hill discovered about the unmastered self that nobody talks about when they describe the path to genuine self-control. The unmastered self isn't weak. It's simply running a program that was written for a different version of your life. And the program, once you understand how it actually works, is considerably easier to rewrite than the conventional wisdom about willpower and discipline would ever suggest. Here's something that will probably reframe everything you've ever believed about self-control. Willpower isn't the answer. Not because it doesn't exist, not because discipline doesn't matter, but because willpower, applied to behavior changed the way most people apply it, is targeting the wrong level of the problem. Think about what willpower actually is. It's conscious effort applied to override an automatic response. The alarm goes off. The automatic response is to stay in bed, and willpower is the conscious force that overrides that response and gets you up anyway. That's real. It works. Sometimes. But here's what Hill observed, and what modern understanding of habit and behavior confirms. Willpower is a finite resource applied to an infinite number of daily moments. Every decision that requires willpower costs something. Every override of an automatic response draws from the same pool of conscious energy. And that pool, depleted across a morning of small resistances and minor overrides, has considerably less left by afternoon, which is precisely when most people's behavior tends to drift back toward whatever the automatic response was in the first place. This is why the person with the most disciplined morning can find themselves making the least disciplined choices by evening. Not because their character failed, because they spent the day applying a finite resource to a structural problem that a finite resource was never going to solve permanently. Hill understood this, though he arrived at it through observation rather than through the neuroscience that would later confirm it. He found that the men who sustained genuine self-mastery over years and decades weren't the ones who maintained the highest levels of conscious willpower. They were the ones who had reduced their reliance on willpower by changing what was automatic. This is the distinction that changes everything about how you approach the project of mastering yourself. Willpower fights the automatic response. Mastery replaces it, not through force, through the specific, patient, deliberate process of practicing a new response often enough that it gradually crosses the threshold from effortful choice into automatic behavior, from something you have to make yourself do into something you simply do, because the groove has been worn deep enough that it now runs without conscious direction. This is what Hill meant when he wrote about the importance of habit in building the foundation of success. He wasn't describing habit as a productivity tool. He was describing it as the mechanism through which the automatic self gets rebuilt from the inside. Not overridden. Rebuilt. The rebuilt automatic self doesn't require willpower to maintain its behavior, any more than the old automatic self required willpower to maintain its own. It simply operates, effortlessly, consistently, below the threshold of conscious deliberation, from patterns that serve the desired direction rather than patterns that work against it. This reframes the entire experience of trying to change yourself. Most people approach behavior change as a battle. The conscious self against the automatic self. Discipline against desire. The person you're trying to become fighting for territory against the person you've been. Hill found that framing was almost always counterproductive. Not because the struggle wasn't real, it was, but because treating it as a battle meant investing enormous energy in fighting something, when the same energy applied differently would have been building something. And building always produces more durable results than fighting, because what you build becomes yours. What you fight remains something other, something external to who you are, requiring ongoing effort to keep at bay, draining the very resources that forward movement requires. The path to genuine self-mastery isn't a battle against the automatic self. It's a patient, deliberate, systematic process of replacing what's automatic with something better, one repetition at a time. In the ordinary moments nobody watches. In the small choices that seem too inconsequential to matter, until enough of them have accumulated to matter enormously. But here's what Hill found about where this process has to begin that most people never consider, because it requires looking somewhere most people genuinely don't want to look. Hill asked a question in his research that most people find genuinely uncomfortable to answer honestly. Not, what do you want to change? Almost everyone has a ready answer to that. The list of things to improve, the habits to build, the behaviors to replace. Most people can produce that list without hesitation because they've been thinking about it, in various forms, for years. The question Hill kept asking was different. What are you actually like when no one is watching? Not the version you described to someone who asked. Not the curated self-assessment that preserves a reasonable image of who you're trying to become. The actual, unguarded, unperformed version of yourself that shows up in the private moments. The ones with no audience, no accountability, no external pressure to be anything other than exactly what you currently are. That version. Because Hill found that the gap between the public self and the private self, between who you present yourself as being and who you actually are in the moments nobody sees, was one of the most precise measurements available of how much self-mastery work remained to be done. Not as a moral judgment, as a structural observation. A person with genuine self-mastery behaves essentially the same whether someone is watching or not. Not because they're performing consistency for an imaginary audience. Because the behavior is genuinely automatic. It runs from the rebuilt internal program rather than from the external pressure of accountability. The person without genuine self-mastery behaves differently in private than in public. Not necessarily dramatically, often in small, seemingly insignificant ways. The standard applied to the work when someone might check it versus when no one will. The care taken with the decision when it might be evaluated versus when it's entirely invisible. The discipline maintained when it's observable versus when the only witness is yourself. Those small private differences are where the actual measurement lives. And sitting honestly with that measurement, really sitting with it, without the self-protective impulse to immediately explain or contextualize or compare yourself favorably to someone worse, is where the work of genuine self-mastery has to begin. Not with a new system, not with a better productivity framework, with honest self-knowledge. Hill was precise about this. He wrote about self-analysis as one of the foundational practices of anyone serious about building genuine capability. Not the comfortable self-assessment that confirms existing beliefs about yourself, but the specific, somewhat uncomfortable examination of the actual gap between intention and behavior, between stated values and lived choices, between who you're trying to become and who you actually are in the moments that reveal it most clearly. This examination requires something most people spend significant energy avoiding: the willingness to be disappointed by what you find. Not devastated, not paralyzed, specifically and productively disappointed, in the way that makes the gap visible enough to work with rather than keeping it hidden beneath a layer of self-protective narrative that makes you feel better but leaves the gap exactly where it was. Because you cannot close a gap you haven't honestly measured. And you cannot honestly measure a gap you're unwilling to look at directly. The men Hill studied who achieved genuine self-mastery almost universally described a specific moment, not always dramatic, often surprisingly quiet, where they looked at themselves with unusual clarity and saw, perhaps for the first time without the softening of self-justification, exactly what they were working with. Not what they wished they were, not what they intended to become, what they actually were, right then, in that honest private moment. And instead of looking away, instead of reaching for the explanation that would make the gap feel smaller or more forgivable, they stayed with what they saw. Let it be real. Let it be the accurate starting point rather than the thing to be denied. And from that specific quality of honest seeing, something became possible that wasn't possible before. Not because honesty is motivating in some general sense. It often isn't. Because you cannot navigate toward a destination you haven't honestly located yourself in relation to. The map is useless without the honest X that marks where you actually are. And right now, I want to ask you to do something with that. If what I just described landed somewhere real, if you felt, even slightly, the specific discomfort of genuine, honest self-recognition rather than just intellectual agreement, write the word success in the comments right now. Not as a declaration of where you're going, as an acknowledgement of where you're willing to honestly start. The people who write that word today are the ones making a different kind of commitment than the one they've been making by default. Not to a better plan, to a more honest starting point. Write it. Because what comes next, the specific mechanism Hill found that makes the gap actually close once you've honestly measured it, is something most people never discover because they never get past the discomfort of the first step. Hill found something about the process of closing the gap between the public self and the private self that contradicts almost everything popular culture teaches about self-improvement. The gap doesn't close through motivation, not through the right podcast, the right book, the right conversation that finally says the thing you needed to hear in the way you needed to hear it. Not through the peak experience of genuine inspiration that arrives occasionally and feels, while it's happening, like it couldn't possibly fade. It fades, not because you're weak, because motivation is a feeling, and feelings are governed by the same automatic system that produces every other feeling, which means motivation, like every other feeling, returns to its baseline once the stimulus that produced it has passed. Hill observed this with a precision that troubled him early in his research, because he kept encountering people who had been genuinely inspired, who had read his work, attended his lectures, absorbed the principles with real understanding and real emotional engagement, and who, months later, were living essentially the same life they had been living before the inspiration arrived. Not because the inspiration wasn't real, because they had treated inspiration as the mechanism of change rather than as the starting point for the actual mechanism. The actual mechanism Hill identified wasn't motivational at all. It was structural. Specifically, it was the deliberate construction of an environment, both internal and external, that made the desired behavior the path of least resistance rather than the path of most resistance. Here's what that actually means in practice. Most people approach behavior change by trying to make themselves do the hard thing in an environment that was built around doing the easy thing. The person trying to eat better who keeps the kitchen stocked exactly as it always was, and relies on willpower to choose differently every time the old options are immediately available. The person trying to think more clearly who hasn't changed what the first 30 minutes of their day look like, and relies on discipline to resist the same pull toward the same automatic consumption that has always occupied that time. The person trying to build something new who hasn't protected a single block of time specifically for building it, and relies on motivation to find the energy for it after a full day of everything else. In every case, the desired behavior is being attempted against the resistance of an environment optimized for the opposite behavior. And willpower, that finite, depletable resource, is being asked to bridge the gap between the two every single day, indefinitely. Hill found that the men who built genuine self-mastery did something different before they ever relied on willpower. They changed the environment, not dramatically, often in small, specific, carefully chosen ways that reduced the friction between their current state and the desired behavior, while simultaneously increasing the friction between their current state and the behavior they were trying to leave behind. The phone moved to another room, the specific time blocked in the calendar before anything else could claim it. The conversation initiated that created accountability before the moment of decision arrived. The small environmental change that meant the path of least resistance now pointed toward the desired behavior rather than away from it. These aren't tricks. They're the recognition of something Hill understood intuitively, and that behavioral science has since confirmed with considerable precision. The automatic self follows the path of least resistance with almost gravitational reliability. which means the most direct way to change what the automatic self does isn't to fight the gravitational pull. It's to change where the path of least resistance leads. Once the environment has been restructured, once the default option is the aligned option rather than the opposite, the energy that was being consumed by willpower becomes available for something else. For the actual work, for the building, for the sustained engagement with the direction that produces results rather than the sustained battle against the environment that consumes the energy those results would have required. But Hill found that environmental restructuring, however powerful, was only part of the mechanism. There was something else required, something internal, something that no external environmental change could substitute for, that determined whether the restructured environment would actually produce lasting change or simply a temporary deviation from the old pattern that eventually corrected itself back. Something about the relationship between the self doing the changing and the self being changed. Something that Hill considered more fundamental than any specific practice or any specific environmental design. And something that, once understood, reframes the entire project of self-mastery in a way that makes it feel less like a battle and more like something else entirely. Hill returned to this idea repeatedly across his body of work, in different forms and different language, because he kept finding it at the center of every genuine transformation he documented. The relationship you have with yourself. Not in the abstract, therapeutic sense that phrase sometimes implies. Something more specific and considerably more practical than that. The specific quality of the ongoing internal conversation. The way you speak to yourself about yourself, in the private moments between external demands, when the only audience for your self-assessment is the self being assessed. Most people have never examined this conversation directly. Not because it's hidden, because it's so constant, so familiar, so thoroughly woven into the ordinary texture of daily inner experience that it stopped being noticeable long ago. It became the background, the water you swim in rather than something you can step back from and look at clearly. But Hill found that this background conversation was doing more to determine the actual trajectory of a person's life than almost any external factor he could identify. Not because of some mystical connection between self-talk and external reality, because of something considerably more mechanical. The way you speak to yourself about yourself determines what you believe is possible for yourself. And what you believe is possible for yourself determines what you attempt. And what you attempt, and how you respond when the attempt produces difficulty, determines what your life eventually produces. The chain is direct. The mechanism is clear. And the beginning of the chain, the point where everything else originates, is the private internal conversation most people have been having on autopilot for decades without ever choosing what it says. Hill found two distinct qualities of internal conversation in the people he studied, and the difference between them was the single, most reliable predictor of outcomes he encountered across his entire research. The first quality he found in people who remained stuck, not in every moment, not without exceptions, but as the dominant tone of their ongoing internal relationship with themselves, was what he called the conversation of the limited self. It didn't sound like obvious self-criticism. It was subtler than that, and considerably more insidious precisely because of its subtlety. It sounded like realism, like the mature, measured, experience-informed perspective of someone who has tried things before and learned what's actually available to someone with their specific history, their specific starting point, their specific combination of resources and limitations. It sounded, in other words, exactly like wisdom. And it consistently produced, across enough years of being treated as wisdom, the specific external reality that wisdom about limitation tends to produce. A life carefully constructed to stay within the boundaries of what the limited self had determined was realistic. The second quality Hill found, in the men who built things that exceeded what anyone would have predicted from their starting points, was something different. Not relentless positivity. Not the performed enthusiasm of someone who has decided to feel good about everything regardless of what's actually happening. something quieter and more durable than either of those things. A conversation that treated the self as someone in the process of becoming something, not as a fixed entity whose capabilities had already been determined by the accumulated evidence of the past, but as a developing one whose current limitations described where it was, not where it was permanently capable of going. This distinction between a self understood as fixed and a self understood as developing sounds philosophical. Its practical consequences are anything but. A fixed self responds to failure as confirmation, as evidence that the existing assessment of capability was accurate, as a reason to adjust expectations back towards something more consistent with what the evidence has shown is realistic. A developing self responds to failure as information, as data about what didn't work in this specific configuration under these specific conditions at this specific point in the development process, as something to be understood and incorporated rather than used as a verdict. Same failure, completely different internal conversation about what it means, and completely different behavior in the days that follow. Hill found that the internal conversation couldn't be changed through affirmation alone, through the deliberate substitution of positive statements for negative ones without changing the underlying relationship that was generating both. It had to be changed through something more fundamental, through a genuine shift in the understanding of what the self actually is, not a finished thing being evaluated, but an ongoing process being directed. And that shift, once genuinely made, changes the quality of the internal conversation in a way that no amount of surface-level positive thinking ever replicates. Because the conversation isn't being performed differently. It's being generated from a different understanding of who is doing the talking and what that person is actually capable of. There's a specific behavior Hill documented in the men who had made the shift from understanding themselves as fixed entities being evaluated to understanding themselves as developing ones being directed, that looked, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from ordinary behavior. But from the inside, it was completely different. They made decisions differently, not more boldly, necessarily, not with more visible confidence or more dramatic commitment to risk, in a way that was quieter than either of those things, and, Hill found, considerably more effective than both. They made decisions from the question of who they were becoming rather than from the question of who they currently were. This distinction sounds small. Its consequences are enormous. Most people, facing a decision, consult their current self. They ask, implicitly or explicitly, what someone with their current level of capability, their current level of confidence, their current relationship with the specific kind of challenge the decision involves, what that person would do. And the current self, being an accurate reflection of everything that's been practiced into automaticity so far, produces an answer consistent with what has always been produced. Not through dishonesty, through the simple fact that the current self can only speak from where it currently is. The developing self consults something different. Not a fantasy version of the self that doesn't exist yet. Something more specific and more immediately accessible than that. The next version. The version that would exist if the current decision were made from slightly more than the current self currently has, from slightly more courage, slightly more commitment, slightly more willingness to engage with the difficulty the decision requires. That next version isn't far away. It's one decision ahead. And consulting it, asking what that version would do rather than what the current version is comfortable doing, produces a consistently different answer. One that requires slightly more than the automatic response would have offered. One that builds, through the act of being chosen, a small piece of the capacity it assumed. Hill found this practice, the habit of deciding from the next version rather than the current one, operating in the behavior of virtually every man he studied who had built something that exceeded what their starting point would have predicted. Not dramatically, in the ordinary texture of daily decision-making, in the small choices that seemed too inconsequential to be worth examining, that turned out, accumulated across enough time, to be precisely where the developing self was being built. And here's what that building eventually produced that the fixed self's careful, realistic, experience-informed decision-making never could. A person who was genuinely capable of more than they were capable of at the beginning. Not because capability arrived from outside. Because the accumulated practice of deciding from the next version rather than the current one had gradually, repetition by repetition, built the next version into the current one. The developing self, practiced consistently, eventually becomes the arrived self. Not through a single dramatic transformation. Through the compounding of hundreds of small decisions made from slightly ahead of where the automatic response would have stopped. This is what Hill meant by self-mastery as the foundation of all other achievement. Not the suppression of weakness. Not the heroic maintenance of discipline against the constant pull of the easier option. The patient, deliberate, largely unglamorous process of building a self that is genuinely more capable. Decision by decision, repetition by repetition, in the ordinary moments that nobody watches and that together constitute the actual substance of a life. And what becomes available to that built self? What the world genuinely cannot stop when this specific kind of internal work has been done, is something that most people imagine only in their most optimistic moments. And that Hill documented as the consistent, mechanical output of a mind that has mastered its own machinery. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Hill made a claim that sounds, on first encounter, almost too bold to take seriously. He said that a person who has achieved genuine self-mastery becomes, in a specific and practical sense, unstoppable, not invulnerable, not immune to difficulty, setback, loss, or the full range of genuinely hard things that life produces without asking permission. Not exempt from the circumstances that affect everyone regardless of how disciplined their mind has become. Unstoppable in a different sense. In the sense that the mechanisms the world typically uses to stop people, discouragement, failure, the opinions of others, circumstances that contradict the direction, lose their stopping power against a person who has built genuine mastery over their own responses to those things. Let me be specific about what this actually means, because the claim deserves precision rather than vague inspiration. Most people get stopped not by external obstacles themselves, but by what those obstacles do to their internal state. The business doesn't grow as fast as expected, and the internal response to that gap is discouragement significant enough to change the behavior. The relationship becomes difficult, and the internal response to that difficulty is a withdrawal of energy from everything else that matters. The opinion of someone whose approval feels important turns negative, and the internal response to that opinion is a revision of the direction, not because the direction was wrong, but because the discomfort of moving against disapproval was more than the unmastered self could sustain. In every case, the external event is the trigger, but the internal response is the actual mechanism of stopping. And the internal response is precisely what self-mastery governs. The person who has built genuine mastery over their own internal responses doesn't eliminate discouragement. Discouragement arrives. The business still isn't growing as fast as expected, and something in the body registers that gap as genuinely uncomfortable. But the response to the discouragement, what happens next, internally, in the space between the feeling arriving and the behavior that follows, is different. Not automatic retreat. Not the unconscious revision of expectations back towards something more consistent with what the current evidence suggests is realistic. Something more deliberate, more examined, more chosen. The discouragement is felt, acknowledged as real, and then, without being suppressed or denied, separated from the decision about what to do next. Because the person with genuine self-mastery has learned, through the patient practice of making this separation hundreds of times in smaller moments, that a feeling is not a directive. That discouragement is information about the current emotional state, not instruction about the correct next action. And the correct next action, determined by the direction rather than by the emotional weather of the present moment, can be identified and taken regardless of what the emotional weather is doing. This is the specific quality Hill was pointing toward when he wrote about emotional control as one of the foundational elements of self-mastery. Not the suppression of emotion, the deliberate separation of emotion from decision. The capacity to feel something fully while simultaneously choosing a response to that feeling rather than automatically executing the response the feeling would have produced if left unexamined. This capacity, built through the accumulated practice of making that separation in the small moments, the minor irritations, the small discouragements, the everyday provocations that most people respond to automatically without ever realizing a choice was available, eventually produces something that changes the fundamental experience of encountering serious difficulty. The serious obstacle, when it arrives, lands in a system that has been trained to separate feeling from decision, that has practiced hundreds of times in lower-stakes situations the specific skill of acknowledging an emotional response without being governed by it. And an obstacle that cannot govern the emotional response cannot stop the direction. It can slow things. It can require adaptation. It can demand more creativity, more patience, more willingness to find the path forward rather than the path that was originally planned. But it cannot stop someone who has mastered the mechanism through which stopping actually happens. That mechanism was never out there. It was always inside. And the person who has spent genuine time and genuine effort building mastery over their own internal responses, who has, through patient repetition in the ordinary moments, rebuilt what happens between stimulus and response, has removed the stopping mechanism from the world's available tools. Which is exactly what Hill meant when he said that self-mastery precedes all other achievement. Not as a moral prerequisite, as a mechanical one. The external world can only stop what the internal world allows to be stopped. Master the internal world, and the external one runs out of leverage. Here's something Hill found that most people spend their entire lives never discovering. The internal world isn't one thing. Most people experience their inner life as a single unified voice, their thoughts, their feelings, their instincts all arriving as expressions of the same self, speaking with the same authority, deserving the same degree of trust and the same quality of obedience. Hill found that the men who built genuine self-mastery had discovered something different, not through philosophical study, necessarily, through the specific, repeated, practical experience of paying close attention to what was actually happening inside them during moments of difficulty, decision, and genuine pressure. They had discovered that the internal voice wasn't single. It was multiple, and not all of those voices deserved the same authority. Hill described this in his writing about what he called the 6 basic fears, the specific, deeply encoded fear responses that he found operating in virtually every person he encountered, usually below the threshold of conscious awareness, generating automatic responses to certain kinds of situations that had nothing to do with the actual current circumstances and everything to do with old experiences that had encoded those fears long before the person had any capacity to evaluate whether the fear was warranted. Fear of poverty, fear of criticism, fear of ill health, fear of loss of love, fear of old age, fear of death. These aren't abstract philosophical concerns. They're active, operational programs running in the background of daily experience, generating specific automatic responses whenever a current situation triggers a pattern that resembles the original encoding. The person who has a deeply encoded fear of poverty doesn't just worry about money in the abstract. They experience specific, automatic, physiological responses, tightening, contraction, the specific quality of scarcity-based thinking, whenever their financial situation produces a stimulus that resembles the original conditions under which that fear was installed. And those responses, Automatic, pre-rational, generated by a program that was written long before the current version of the self existed, govern behavior in ways that the conscious, reasoned, forward-looking self would never choose if it were actually in charge. Which is precisely Hill's point. The unmastered self isn't in charge. The fear program is. And the fear program, operating from an outdated map of what's threatening and what's safe, consistently produces responses optimized for the conditions that created it, conditions that may no longer exist, may never have been as threatening as they seemed, may bear only superficial resemblance to the current situation the person is actually navigating. The first step toward genuine self-mastery, Hill found, wasn't to eliminate these fear responses. That's not actually possible, and attempting it through suppression produces its own specific category of damage. It was to see them, to develop the specific quality of internal attention that can notice a fear response activating, can feel the tightening, the contraction, the automatic narrowing of perceived options that fear produces, and recognize it for what it actually is. Not truth about the current situation. An old program firing in response to a trigger that resembles the original encoding. That recognition, the ability to feel the fear response while simultaneously understanding that the fear response is not a reliable guide to current reality, is itself a form of mastery. Not because it makes the response go away, because it creates a space between the response and the behavior that follows. And in that space, something becomes available that isn't available when the fear response and the behavioral output are fused into a single automatic event. Choice. The specific, deliberate, informed choice about how to respond to the current situation, made from an accurate assessment of what the current situation actually requires rather than from the fear program's assessment of what the original situation required. Hill watched this capacity, the ability to notice fear without being governed by it, produce something in the men who developed it that he found genuinely remarkable. Not fearlessness, something more useful than fearlessness. A mind that could operate clearly in the presence of fear, that could think accurately, decide wisely, and act effectively, while simultaneously carrying the full weight of genuine emotional difficulty, without needing the difficulty to resolve before clear thinking and effective action became possible. That capacity, thinking clearly under pressure, deciding wisely in difficulty, acting effectively while afraid, is worth more in the actual navigation of a real life than the absence of fear ever could be. Because fear doesn't leave. Not completely. Not permanently. What changes is whether it drives. Hill documented something about the specific moment fear loses its authority that most people never anticipate correctly. They imagine it as a dramatic shift. A singular experience of courage so complete that the old fear simply stops showing up, replaced cleanly by a new, more capable version of the self that moves through the world without the weight of the old responses. That's not what he found. What he found was something considerably less cinematic and considerably more useful to understand in advance. Fear loses its authority gradually, not through a single act of confrontation, not through the heroic decision that rewrites everything from a single point in time, through the accumulated experience of making choices in the presence of fear, repeatedly, in moments both small and significant, and discovering, each time, that what actually happened was something the fear was wrong about. This last part is essential. Fear doesn't just make you hesitate. It makes predictions. Specific, vivid, emotionally compelling predictions about what will happen if you do the thing the fear is advising against. The relationship that will be damaged. The opportunity that will be lost. The humiliation that will follow. The confirmation that you were wrong to try, that the assessment of the limited self was accurate all along, that the realistic thing was to stay within the boundaries of what had already been proven safe. These predictions feel like knowledge. They arrive with the specific quality of certainty that fear lends to its forecasts, a certainty that has nothing to do with the actual probability of the predicted outcome, and everything to do with how emotionally vivid the original encoding was. And most people, facing that certainty, treat it as reliable information about what will actually happen. They don't act. The fear's prediction goes untested. And because it goes untested, it maintains its authority indefinitely, because authority built on unexamined predictions is never challenged by actual outcomes. Hill found that the men who systematically dismantled fear's authority in their own internal world did so through a specific practice that sounds almost insultingly simple once you understand it. They tested the predictions, not recklessly, not without genuine assessment of real risk and real consequence, but deliberately, consistently, with the specific intention of generating actual data about what actually happens, rather than allowing the fear's prediction to stand as the only available information. The call was made. The presentation was given. The idea was shared. The boundary was set. The ask was made. The direction was pursued past the point where the fear said to stop. And then something happened that wasn't the catastrophe the fear had predicted. Sometimes the outcome was genuinely difficult. Sometimes things didn't go the way that was hoped. But even the genuinely difficult outcomes were almost always more survivable, more informative, and less catastrophic than the fear's vivid prediction had suggested they would be. And the brain, which updates its predictions based on actual experience, incorporated that information. Not instantly, not after a single data point, but gradually, across enough tested predictions, the fear's forecasts began losing their felt quality of certainty. They began arriving as suggestions rather than verdicts, as one possible outcome among several rather than the inevitable consequence of doing the thing the fear advised against. And that shift, from verdict to suggestion, is where the authority actually transfers, not from fear to fearlessness, from fear to the informed, experience-based judgment of a self that has generated enough actual data about what actually happens to trust its own assessment over the fear program's prediction. Hill called this the development of courage, not as a character trait some people are born with and others aren't, but as a specific capability built through the accumulated experience of acting in the presence of fear and discovering that the action was survivable. Courage, in this framework, isn't the absence of fear. It's the presence of enough actual experience with feared outcomes to know that the fear's authority was always overstated. And that knowledge, held not as a belief but as accumulated personal experience, changes the fundamental experience of encountering fear in a way that no amount of inspiration or positive thinking ever could. Because it's not borrowed, it's earned, through the specific, repeated, unglamorous experience of testing predictions rather than living inside them. And what a mind that has systematically dismantled fear's authority through this kind of accumulated testing can do. The range of decisions it can make, the range of risks it can genuinely evaluate rather than automatically avoid, the range of opportunities it can actually consider rather than reflexively dismiss, is qualitatively different from what was available before the testing began. Not because the world changed, because the internal instrument doing the perceiving changed. And there's one final dimension of self-mastery that Hill considered more important than all of the others. Something that ties everything together, something that determines whether the work we've been discussing produces lasting transformation or simply a sophisticated new version of the same old pattern wearing different clothes. Hill spent the final years of his research trying to articulate something he had been observing for decades without fully being able to name. He had documented the mechanism of habit, the restructuring of environment, the shift from fixed to developing self-understanding, the internal conversation and its consequences, the separation of emotion from decision, the systematic dismantling of fear's authority through the accumulated experience of tested predictions. All of it real, all of it documented across enough lives to be treated as reliable rather than coincidental. But there was something underneath all of it, a quality he kept finding in the men whose transformation had genuinely held over years and decades. that was absent in the men whose transformation had been real but temporary, that he struggled to capture precisely until late in his work. He eventually called it coherence, not in the abstract sense, in the specific, practical sense of alignment between what a person said they valued and what their actual daily behavior reflected about what they valued. Most people carry a significant gap between these two things without fully realizing it. They say they value their health. Their daily choices, examined honestly, reflect something different. They say they value their relationships. The actual distribution of their time and attention tells a more complicated story. They say they value building something meaningful. The actual texture of their days, where the hours go, what gets prioritized when priorities compete, often reflects a different hierarchy than the stated one. This gap isn't hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It's not deliberate dishonesty about what matters. It's the specific output of a self that hasn't yet been brought into alignment, where the conscious values and the automatic behavior are still running on different programs, pointing in different directions, producing the chronic low-grade friction of a life that doesn't quite feel like it belongs to the person living it. Hill found that this friction, this persistent sense of living slightly sideways from your own values, was one of the most reliable signs that the deeper work of self-mastery remained incomplete. Not because perfect alignment is achievable or even the actual goal, but because the degree of misalignment between stated values and actual behavior is a precise measurement of how much of the self remains unmastered, still running the old automatic program rather than the one that corresponds to what the person actually, genuinely, deliberately chooses to be. Coherence, real coherence, not the performed version that looks aligned from the outside while the private self runs a different program, produces something Hill found almost impossible to overstate in its practical significance. It produces energy, not in a metaphorical sense, in the literal, functional sense that a person whose daily behavior corresponds to their genuine values isn't spending energy managing the gap between the two. That gap management is invisible because it's automatic, but it's consuming resources continuously, the same resources that would otherwise be available for the actual work of building the life the stated values point toward. The person living in significant misalignment between values and behavior is running two programs simultaneously, and the energy cost of that dual operation is paid in the specific quality of chronic depletion that has nothing to do with how much sleep they got or how many tasks they completed. It's the depletion of a self at war with itself. And the person who has done the work, who has brought their daily behavior into genuine correspondence with their actual values, one choice at a time, through the patient practice of everything we've discussed, experiences something on the other side of that work that most people have never felt. The specific quality of energy that belongs to a self that isn't fighting itself. Hill described this as the natural state of a person who has achieved genuine self-mastery, not a heightened state requiring maintenance, simply what remains when the energy cost of internal misalignment has been removed, and what that energy, suddenly available, makes possible in a person's external life, the quality of work it enables, the quality of relationships it sustains, the quality of thinking it produces, the quality of presence it generates in every interaction and every opportunity, is something the divided, misaligned, self-at-war version of that same person could never have produced. Not because the capability wasn't there, because the capability was there all along, consuming itself in the management of internal division rather than expressing itself in the building of something real. Self-mastery doesn't create capability. It liberates it. Let's go back to where we started. The one enemy that has sabotaged every plan you've ever made, every goal you've ever set, every version of a better life you've ever tried to build, isn't out there. It never was. You've spent the last hour understanding why that's true in a way that goes considerably deeper than the surface-level acknowledgement most people offer and then set aside without changing anything. The unmastered self isn't a villain. It isn't a character flaw. It isn't evidence of insufficient strength or insufficient desire or insufficient anything. It's a program, built from accumulated experience, encoded through repetition, running automatically, below the threshold of conscious deliberation, producing the behavior that corresponds to its instructions rather than the behavior that corresponds to your conscious intentions. And programs can be rewritten, not instantly, not through a single decision made in a peak moment of motivation. Through the specific, patient, largely unglamorous process Hill documented across 20 years and hundreds of lives. The process of rebuilding what's automatic, one repetition at a time, in the ordinary moments that nobody watches and that together constitute the actual substance of a life. You've seen what that process requires. The honest self-examination that doesn't soften the gap between who you are in public and who you are in private. The environmental restructuring that makes the desired behavior the path of least resistance rather than the path of most resistance. The shift from understanding yourself as a fixed entity being evaluated to understanding yourself as a developing one being directed. The deliberate separation of emotion from decision. The systematic testing of fear's predictions rather than living inside them indefinitely. The patient work of bringing daily behavior into genuine correspondence with actual values. None of this is heroic in the conventional sense. None of it announces itself dramatically. None of it produces the singular transformative moment that makes for a satisfying story when told in retrospect. It produces something more durable than any dramatic moment ever could. A self that has been genuinely rebuilt from the inside. Not performed differently, not presented more carefully, actually different, at the level where behavior is actually governed, in the automatic responses that show up when no one is watching and nothing is demanding a curated version of who you're trying to become. Hill found something specific about this rebuilt self that he returned to at the end of his research with unusual emphasis. It was hard to stop, not impossible to encounter difficulty. Difficulty arrived for these men with the same reliability it arrives for everyone. Not immune to setback. Setbacks happened, sometimes significant ones, sometimes genuinely threatening to the direction. But the mechanisms through which people typically get stopped, the discouragement that revises expectations, the fear that narrows perceived options, the internal friction of a self at war with itself, the automatic retreat to the comfortable and familiar, those mechanisms had been systematically dismantled. Not by exceptional character, by the accumulated work of ordinary moments. And what remained, once those mechanisms were gone, was a self that moved through the world differently. Not louder, not more aggressive, not with the performed confidence of someone trying to convince others, and themselves, that they have what it takes. With something quieter and more powerful than any of those things. The specific, settled, unperformative quality of someone who has done the internal work and knows what they're made of. Not because they declared it, but because they discovered it, in the private moments nobody watched, in the choices that didn't have an audience, in the repetitions that built something real rather than something visible. That self doesn't need the world to cooperate. It doesn't need the circumstances to be favorable, the timing to be perfect, the people around it to believe in the direction before committing to it fully. It moves because it has mastered what movement requires. It continues because it has dismantled what stopping depended on. It builds because it has learned, through the patient, unglamorous work of genuine self-mastery, that the only thing that ever had the power to stop it was the part of itself it hadn't yet brought under its own authority. And that part, rebuilt, redirected, gradually brought into alignment with the actual values and the actual direction, no longer stops anything. Hill spent 20 years looking for what separated the lives that built something extraordinary from the lives that intended to. He found it in the same place every time. Not out there. In here. In the specific, private, unwitnessed work of becoming someone who had mastered the only thing that was ever actually in their control. Themselves. The world has no power over a person who has done that work. Not because the world becomes easier, because the person who has mastered themselves has removed the mechanism through which the world's difficulty ever translated into personal defeat. Master yourself first. Then nothing can stop you. Not as inspiration, as the most practical thing Napoleon Hill ever documented. If this video gave you something real, something that lands differently than what you came in with, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who are still being stopped by the only enemy that was ever actually theirs to defeat. Every video here exists for one reason: to help you become the person the world genuinely cannot stop.